So somehow my phone has decided that it doesn't want to record more than a few minutes of footage at a time. I have gone through, I have deleted a number of things. This is take number 6 for anybody that's interested. And hopefully we can make it through the entire recording today, because this should be the last reading we have. Donald continues to exist in the dark space between the fear of indifference and the fear of failure that led to his brother's destruction. It took 42 years for the destruction to be completed, but the foundations were laid early and played out before Donald's eyes as he was experiencing his own trauma. The combination of those two things, what he witnessed and what he experienced, both isolate him and terrified him. The role that fear played in his childhood and the role it plays now can't be overstated, and the fact that fear continues to be an overriding emotion for him speaks to the hell that must have existed inside the house 6 decades ago. Every time you hear Donald talking about how something is the greatest, the best, the biggest, the most tremendous, the implication being that he made it so, you have to remember that the man speaking is still, in essential ways, the same little boy who is desperately worried that he, like his older brother, is inadequate, and that he too will be destroyed for his inadequacy. At a very deep level, his bragging and false bravado are not directed at the audience in front of him, but at the audience of one, his long-dead father. Donald has always been able to get away with making blanket statements. I know more about fill in the blank than anybody, believe me. Or the other iteration, nobody knows more about fill in the blank than me. He's been allowed to riff about the nuclear weapons, trade with China, and other things about which he knows nothing. He's gone essentially unchallenged when touting the efficacy of drugs for the treatment of COVID-19 that have not been tested or engaging is an absurd revisionist history in which he's never made a mistake and nothing is his fault. It's easy to sound coherent and somewhat knowledgeable when you control the narrative and are never pressed to elaborate on your premise or demonstrate that you actually understand the underlying facts. It is an indictment, among many, of the media that none of that changed during the campaign, when exposing Donald's lies and outrageous claims might actually have saved us from his presidency. On the few occasions he was asked about his position and policies, which for all intent and purpose don't really exist, he still wasn't expected or required to make sense or demonstrate any depth of understanding. Since the election, he's figured out how to avoid such questions completely. White House press briefings and formal news conferences have been replaced with chopper talk, during which he can pretend he can't hear any unwelcome questions over the noise of the helicopter blades. In 2020, his pandemic press briefings quickly devolved into mini campaign rallies filled with self-congratulatory demagoguery and ring-kissing. In them, he has denied the unconscionable failures that have already killed thousands, lied about the progress that's being made, and scapegoated the very people who are risking their lives to save us despite being denied adequate protection and equipment by his administration. Even as hundreds of thousands of Americans are sick and dying, he spins it as a victory, as proof of his stunning leadership, and in the event that anybody thinks he's capable of being serious or somber, he'll throw in a joke about betting models or lie about the size of his Facebook following for good measure. Still, the news networks refuse to pull away. The few journalists who do challenge him, and even those who simply ask Donald for words of comfort for a terrified nation, are derided and dismissed as nasty. And through lines from Donald's early destructive behavior that Fred actively encouraged to the media's unwillingness to challenge him and the Republican Party's willingness to turn a blind eye to the daily corruption he has committed since January 20th, 2017, have led to the impending collapse of this once great nation's economy, democracy, and health. We must dispense with the idea of Donald's strategic brilliance in understanding the intersection of media and politics. He doesn't have a strategy. He never has. Despite the fluke that was his electoral advantage and a victory that was at best suspect and at worst illegitimate, he never had his finger on the pulse of the zeitgeist. His bluster and shamelessness just happened to resonate with certain segments of the population. If what he was doing during the 2016 campaign hadn't worked, he would have kept doing it anyway, because lying, playing to the lowest common denominator, cheating, and sowing division are all he knows. He is as incapable of adjusting to changing circumstances as he is of becoming presidential. He did tap into a certain bigotry and INCHOATE. No idea. Rage, which he's always been good at doing. The full-page screed he paid to publish in the New York Times in 1989, calling for the Central Park Five to be put to death, wasn't about his deep concern for the rule of law. It was an easy opportunity for him to take on a deeply serious topic that was very important to the city while sounding like an authority in the influential and prestigious pages of the Gray Lady. It was unvarnished racism meant to stir up racial animosity in a city already seething with it. All five boys, Kevin Richardson, Antron McCrae, Raymond Santana, Corey Wise, and Yusuf Salam, were subsequently cleared, proven innocent via incontrovertible DNA evidence. To this day, however, Donald insists that they were guilty. Yet another example of his inability to drop a preferred narrative, even when it's contradicted by established fact. Donald takes any rebuke as a challenge and doubles down on the behavior that drew fire in the first place, as if criticism is permission to do worse. Fred came to appreciate Donald's obstinacy because it signaled the kind of toughness he sought in his sons. 50 years later, people are literally dying because of his catastrophic decisions and disastrous inaction. With millions of lives at stake, he takes accusations about the federal government's failure to provide ventilators personally, threatening to withhold funding and life-saving equipment from states whose governors don't pay sufficient homage to him. That doesn't surprise me. The deafening silence in response to such a blatant display of sociopathic disregard for human life, or the consequences for one's actions, on the other hand, fills me with despair and reminds me that Donald isn't really the problem after all. This is the end result of Donald's having continually been given a pass and rewarded not just for his failure, but for his transgressions. Against tradition, against decency, against the law, and against fellow human beings. His acquittal in the sham Senate impeachment trial was another such reward for bad behavior. The lies may come true in his mind as soon as he utters them, but they're still lies. It's just another way for him to see what he can get away with, and so far, he's gotten away with everything. Now into the epilogue. The 10th circle. On November 9th, 2016, my despair was triggered in part by the certainty that Donald's cruelty and incompetence would get people killed. My best guess at the time was that would occur through a disaster of his own making, such as an avoidable war he either provoked or stumbled into. I couldn't have anticipated how many people would willingly enable his worst instincts, which have resulted in government-sanctioned kidnapping of children, detaining of refugees at the border, and betrayal of our allies, among other atrocities. And I couldn't have foreseen that a global pandemic would present itself, allowing him to display his grotesque indifference to the lives of other people. Donald's initial response to COVID-19 underscores his need to minimize negativity at all costs. Fear, the equivalent of weakness in our family, is as unacceptable to him now as it was when he was 3 years old. When Donald is in the most trouble, superlatives are no longer enough. Both the situation and his reaction to it must be unique, even if absurd or nonsensical. On his watch, no hurricane has ever been as wet as Hurricane Maria. Nobody could have predicted a pandemic that his own Department of Health and Human Services was running simulations for just a few months before COVID-19 struck in Washington state. Why does he do this? Fear. Donald didn't drag his feet in December 2019, in January, in February, in March because of his narcissism. He did it because of his fear of appearing weak or failing to project the message that everything was great, beautiful, and perfect. The irony is that his failure to face the truth was inevitable and led to massive failure anyway. In this case, the lives of potentially hundreds of thousands of people will be lost and the economy of the richest country in history may well be destroyed. Donald will acknowledge none of this, moving the goalposts to hide the evidence and convincing himself in the process that he's done a better job than anybody else could have if only a few 100,000 die instead of 2 million. Get even with people who've screwed you, Donald said. But often the person he's getting revenge on is somebody he screwed over first, such as the contractors he's refused to pay or the niece and nephew he refused to protect. Even when he manages to hit his target, his aim is so bad that he causes collateral damage. Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, and certainly the de facto leader of the country's COVID-19 response, has committed not only the sin of insufficiently kissing Donald's ass, but the ultimate sin of showing Donald up by being better and more competent, a real leader who is respected and effective and admired. Donald can't fight back by shutting Cuomo up or reversing his decisions. Having abdicated his authority to lead a nationwide response, he no longer has the ability to counter decisions made at the state level. Donald can insult Cuomo and complain about him, but every day the governor's real leadership further reveals Donald as a petty, pathetic little man, ignorant, incapable, out of his depth, and lost in his own delusional spin. What Donald can do in order to offset the powerlessness and rage he feels to punish the rest of us. He'll withhold ventilators or steal supplies from states that have not groveled sufficiently. If New York continues not to have enough equipment, Cuomo will look bad. The rest of us be damned. Thankfully, Donald doesn't have many supporters in New York City, but even some of those will die because of his craven need for revenge. What Donald thinks is justified retaliation is, in this context, mass murder. It would have been easy for Donald to be a hero. People who have hated and criticized him would have forgiven or overlooked his endless stream of appalling actions if he'd simply had somebody take the pandemic preparedness manual down from the shelf where it was put up after the Obama administration gave it to him. If he'd alerted the appropriate agencies and state governments at the first evidence the virus was highly contagious, had extremely high mortality rates, and was not being contained. If he'd invoked the Defense Production Act of 1950 to begin production of PPE, ventilators, and other necessary equipment to prepare the country to deal with the worst case scenario. If he'd allowed medical and scientific experts to give daily press conferences during which facts were presented clearly and honestly, if he'd ensured that there was a systematic top-down approach and coordinated among all the necessary agencies, Dayenu. Most of those tasks would have required almost no effort on his part. All he would have had to do was make a couple of phone calls, give a speech or two, then delegate everything else. He might have been accused of being too cautious, but most of us would have said, safe, and many more of us would have survived. Instead, states are forced to buy vital supplies from private contractors. The federal government commandeers those supplies, and then FEMA distributes them back to private contractors who then resell them. While thousands of Americans die alone, Donald touts stock market gains. As my father lay dying alone, Donald went to the movies. If he can in any way profit from your death, he'll facilitate it, and then he'll ignore the fact that you died. Why did it take so long for Donald to act? Why didn't he take the novel coronavirus seriously? In part because, like my grandfather, he has no imagination. The pandemic didn't immediately have to do with him, and managing the crisis in every moment doesn't help him promote his preferred narrative that no one has ever done a better job than he has. As the pandemic moved into its third, then fourth month, and the death toll continued its rise into the tens of thousands, the press started to comment on Donald's lack of empathy for those who have died and the families they leave behind. The simple fact is that Donald is fundamentally incapable of acknowledging the suffering of others. Telling the story of those we've lost would bore him. Acknowledging the victims of COVID-19 would be to associate himself with their weakness, a trait his father taught him to despise. Donald can no more advocate for the sick and the dying than he could put himself between his father and Freddie. Perhaps most crucially for Donald, there is no value in empathy. No tangible upside to caring for other people. David Korn wrote, "Everything is transactional for this poor, broken human being. Everything." It is an epic tragedy for a parental failure that my uncle does not understand that he or anybody else has intrinsic worth. In Donald's mind, even acknowledging an inevitable threat would indicate weakness. Taking responsibility would open him up to blame. Being a hero, being good, is impossible for him. The same could be said of his handling of the worst civil unrest since the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. This is another crisis in which it would have been so easy for Donald to triumph. But his ignorance overwhelms his ability to turn to his advantage the third national catastrophe to occur on his watch. An effective response would have entailed a call for unity, but Donald requires division. It is the only way he knows how to survive. My grandfather ensured that decades ago when he turned his children against each other. I can only imagine the envy with which Donald watched Derek Chauvin's casual cruelty and monstrous indifference as he murdered George Floyd. Hands in his pockets, his insolent gaze aimed at the camera. I can only imagine that Donald wishes it had been his knee on Floyd's neck. Instead, Donald withdraws to his comfort zones, Twitter, Fox News, casting blame from afar, protected by a figurative or literal bunker. He rants about the weakness of others even as he demonstrates his own, but he can never escape the fact that he is, and always will be, a terrified little boy. Donald's monstrosity is the manifestation of the very weakness within him that he's been running from his entire life. For him, there has never been an option but to be positive, to project strength, no matter how illusory, because doing anything else carries a death sentence. My father's short life is evidence of that. The country is now suffering from the same toxic positivity that my grandfather deployed specifically to drown out his ailing wife, torment his dying son, and damage past healing the psyche of his favorite child, Donald J. Trump. Everything's great, right, Toots? That's it. That's all she wrote. All right, folks. Well, thus concludes not only our broadcast day, but the book. Unless I hear from somebody, I may or may not pick this up again with another title. You let me know. Do you never want to hear from me again? I would totally buy that. I am not the best orator. I do not take multiple takes. I do not edit things kindly. So yeah, there's all that. Anyway, stay sane. Avoid hate fest. It's just awful. I catch glimpses of a couple of things on the news, and for real, oh, they make me so sad and sick and angry. So maybe save yourself the trouble and just believe me, don't watch it. Anyway, love you all. Hopefully we get to spend some time together soon. And have a good night.